On the night of June 7th, a single drone strike punched holes through a stretch of asphalt in southern Ukraine. By morning, the road surface of the Chongar Bridge, a structure most people outside the region have never heard of, was unusable. Russian-appointed Kherson Governor Vladimir Saldo confirmed it himself on Telegram, almost casually, as if announcing a traffic update. But this was not a traffic update. It was the moment 60,000 Russian soldiers on the Crimean peninsula effectively lost their last reliable supply artery. And here is the part that should make every analyst pause. The bridge wasn't the target. Not really. The bridge was the symptom. What collapsed that night was something much larger than a span of concrete over Sivash Lake, and Russia's own military bloggers were the first to admit it. Because the visible story is a damaged road deck. The real story is the quiet transformation of Crimea from Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier into something else entirely, a logistics trap, a peninsula that now consumes more resources to hold than it generates in strategic value. Let me show you how that happened, and why what comes next may redefine how modern wars are fought. To understand why Chongar matters, forget the bridge for a moment. Picture instead a 630-kilometer umbilical cord stretching from Russian-held southern Ukraine into Crimea. Every liter of diesel, every artillery shell, every spare tank tread, every loaf of bread feeding the Russian garrison flowed through this corridor. There were only ever two arteries keeping Crimea alive. The Kerch Bridge, restricted for heavy vehicles after years of Ukrainian strikes, and this land corridor, which had quietly become the primary lifeline. The corridor itself has three entry points into the peninsula: Armyansk in the west, Perekop in the center, and Chongar in the east. Of these three, Chongar was the most efficient, the shortest, the fastest, the one Russian logistics planners depended on. That dependency was the vulnerability. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces had been studying this bridge for weeks. Convoy timings, transit density, patterns of movement. The 3rd Special Purpose Regiment had already announced something extraordinary just days earlier. They had established what they called air control over a stretch of the Melitopol-Chongar route. Drones, not soldiers, were now deciding what moved on that road. Then they struck the choke point. And here is where the story stops being about Ukraine versus Russia and starts being about something larger. When Chongar closed, the math changed instantly. Russian convoys now had two options: Armyansk or Perekop, both further west, both adding 50 to 150 kilometers to every supply run, both forcing trucks closer to active front lines, into drone-saturated airspace, into kill zones Ukraine had been preparing for months. More distance means more fuel burned. More time on the road means more exposure. More exposure means more losses. More losses mean more pressure to send replacement convoys, which then burn more fuel, take more time, suffer more losses. This is not a supply problem. This is a feedback loop designed to consume itself. And the numbers tell you exactly how aggressive that loop has become. On the R-280 Novorossiysk highway, the spine of the corridor, Ukrainian medium-range drones systematically struck convoys between 20 and 300 kilometers behind the front line throughout May. OSINT groups documented more than 125 destroyed fuel tankers and military trucks in a single month. Governor Saldo had already been forced to issue a decree restricting heavy vehicle traffic by late May. Now the most efficient route those restricted vehicles could still use has also closed. But the corridor is just the surface. Underneath it, something more important is happening, and Russian military analysts are starting to name it. 20 kilometers south of Chongar sits Jankoy, to outsiders, a small Crimean town. To Russian logistics planners, the nervous system of the entire peninsula's military presence. Railway junctions converge here. Ammunition depots cluster here. Fuel terminals concentrate here. Every convoy that crossed Chongar fed Jankoy first, and Jankoy then distributed outward to Sevastopol, Simferopol, Feodosia, and the frontline staging areas. Cut Chongar, and you don't just cut a bridge. You sever Jankoy from its primary intake. Here is what that means in operational terms. A Russian brigade carries roughly 10 days of self-sustaining supplies. After that, it is entirely dependent on the resupply chain. When ammunition depots stop refilling, artillery firepower drops within days. When fuel terminals run dry, armored vehicles become stationary targets. When spare parts stop flowing, damaged equipment becomes scrap. The Russian garrison in Crimea numbers between 40,000 and 60,000 soldiers. Feeding them required hundreds of vehicles crossing the corridor every single day. A single fuel tanker destroyed disrupts 24 hours of brigade-level fuel consumption. May saw 125 destroyed. You can see where this curve is heading, but there is a second-order effect that almost nobody discusses, and it is the one that should worry Moscow most. Crimea's air defense umbrella. The S-400 batteries, the Panzer systems, the layered radar network, is the reason Russia could still pretend the peninsula was secure. Those systems run on electricity, continuously. The fixed power grid handles part of the load. Mobile diesel generators handle the rest. Generators burn fuel, the same fuel that just stopped flowing through Chongar. When fuel deliveries slow, generator runtime gets rationed. When runtime gets rationed, radar coverage develops gaps. When radar coverage develops gaps, more Ukrainian drones reach their targets undetected. More drones reaching targets means more fuel depots destroyed, more convoys hit, more delays in the supply chain. The vicious cycle deepens with every rotation. This is what military theorists call a cascading systems failure. One vulnerability doesn't cause one problem. It triggers a chain reaction that compounds across domains. Logistics affects air defense. Air defense affects logistics. Both affect frontline operations. All three affect morale. And Ukraine is consciously, methodically feeding the cycle. The Chongar strike was not an isolated operation. It was the opening move in a synchronized three-layer attack. And the other two layers tell you everything about Ukraine's actual strategy. The same night the bridge was hit, Ukrainian long-range kamikaze drones struck the Sovkhoznaya fuel depot near Lenino. This facility sits roughly 200 kilometers from the front line, historically beyond Ukrainian reach. Built in the Soviet era, closed in the 1990s, reactivated in 2015 by the BIK Terminal Company after annexation. Russia had deliberately rebuilt it as part of Crimea's military infrastructure. NASA firm's satellite imagery confirmed the heat signature expanding through the night. The fire was not contained. The second target was larger, the Naval Petroleum Terminal at Feodosia, Crimea's biggest fuel storage complex. Capacity, 250,000 tons. Function, emergency strategic reserve. The backup activated when normal supply lines fail. Russia was holding this terminal as insurance against exactly the scenario unfolding that night. Ukraine struck the insurance. Drones traveled approximately 250 kilometers to reach the target. Explosions echoed across Feodosia. The Atesh partisan movement and the Crimean Wind Monitoring Channel confirmed the strike. A third target, a military unit in Sovetskoye, was hit the same night. Explosion sounds were reported from Chongar, Sevastopol, and Simferopol. In a single night, Ukraine cut the road the fuel travels on, struck the depots where it is stored, and hit the units that consume it. 3 layers. 1 coordinated operation, total logistics destruction. And by morning, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were visible on Crimea's streets. On the evening of June 6th, the Sevastopol Occupation Administration announced something almost unthinkable for a region Russia has spent 12 years promoting as a model of imperial restoration. Rationed fuel distribution by personal QR code. 20 liters maximum per vehicle, once per week. Codes valid only between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., only at designated stations. The system was announced after midnight. By 1:47 a.m. on June 7th, Governor Razvozhayev announced the day's codes were exhausted. The system had lasted less than 2 hours. The codes ran out. The lines didn't. Drivers began queuing from midnight for the next day's allocation. Sevastopol was not an outlier. It was the model. Crimea's appointed head, Aksionov, had already halted cash gasoline sales on June 4th, openly stating there would be no open sale coupons in the near future. The next day, he opened a helpline for tourists stranded on the peninsula. Hundreds of vacationers who had driven in for summer and now could not find enough fuel to drive out. Priority was assigned to emergency services and law enforcement. Even then, Sevastopol's 400-vehicle public transit fleet could not secure sufficient diesel. Black market prices tripled. Empty shelves appeared in grocery stores because the trucks delivering food also could not find fuel. Russia called Crimea its unsinkable aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier has run out of fuel. But here is the deeper question, the one Ukrainian strategists are quietly answering and Russian commentators are starting to ask out loud. This crisis did not emerge in June. It is the visible surface of a multi-year, multi-domain campaign that began at sea. Phase 1 targeted the Black Sea Fleet. Ukrainian naval drones, a weapon system that essentially did not exist before this war, systematically attacked Russian warships. The flagship Moskva was sunk. Landing ships were destroyed. Fleet losses exceeded 1/3 of operational tonnage. Russia was forced to relocate surviving vessels from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Sea-based resupply to Crimea collapsed. Phase 2 targeted the Kerch Bridge. The 2022 and 2023 strikes did not destroy it, but they permanently restricted heavy cargo capacity. On the same night Chongar was hit, Neptune missiles were launched at Kerch again. Russian air defense claims interception. But the message was delivered. Kerch is not safe. Phase 3 is the campaign currently unfolding inside Russia itself. According to Bloomberg data, 38 strikes hit Russian refineries between January and May 2026, with 16 in May alone, the highest single-month total of the entire war. Reuters reports that by mid-May, refineries with combined daily capacity of 238,000 tons, roughly a quarter of total Russian refining capacity, had suspended operations. Production dropped. Demand didn't. The gap reflected onto Crimea's streets. And Phase 4 is what we are watching now. The land corridor, the last artery, brought under systematic drone fire, with one Ukrainian Special Purpose Regiment formally declaring air control over key segments, sea closed, Kerch restricted, refineries burning, corridor under fire, depots inside Crimea destroyed. A Russian telegram channel called Madame Secretary, a pro-war source, not a Ukrainian one, summarized it with unusual clarity. A long and consistent strategy is becoming apparent. First, the clearing of the sea corridor, then attacks on the Black Sea Fleet, then the isolation of Crimea. In parallel, the campaign against refineries, now pressure on the highway. Pro-Russian commentator Dmitriev went further. Crimea is a very logistically vulnerable place. In past wars, the peninsula has usually become a trap for the forces defending it. That sentence, written by a Russian, not a Ukrainian, captures the entire strategic shift. Here is the part that should reshape how we think about modern warfare. The Chongar Bridge can be repaired. Russia has done it before. After the 2023 storm shadow strikes, traffic resumed within weeks. Pontoon bridges can be deployed. Damaged decking can be replaced. The land corridor is 630 kilometers long, with multiple alternative routes. As long as Armyansk and Perekop remain open, complete isolation is not in play. Russia is also adapting. Additional air defense around critical bridges, convoys moving in smaller groups during night hours, decoy vehicles to confuse drone targeting. But the cost asymmetry is now permanent, and it is accelerating. In 2023, Chongar was struck with Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Expensive, limited in number. Every launch required diplomatic coordination with Western suppliers. In 2026, the same bridge is being hit with kamikaze drones costing a few $1,000s each. Ukrainian drone production capacity expands every month. Effective range has grown from roughly 100 kilometers in 2024 to over 300 kilometers in 2026. When Russia repairs a bridge, Ukraine can strike it again the next night. Repair takes weeks. A strike takes one night. Russia spends millions to restore what Ukraine destroys for thousands. Every repair cycle pulls resources from the front. Every strike accumulates permanent attrition. The arithmetic compounds against Moscow. This is the paradigm shift hiding inside the Chongar story. The old assumption was that holding territory required defeating the army that wanted to take it. The emerging reality is that holding territory now requires defending against weapons that cost less than the supplies they destroy. Strategic geography has become a liability when defending it costs more than the geography is worth. That is a new rule of war, and it applies far beyond Crimea. Let me return to where we started. The bridge. Chongar was never just a bridge. It was the visible expression of a hidden truth about Crimea's military value, a truth Russian commentators are now articulating more clearly than Western analysts. The peninsula is no longer a military asset. It is a military burden. Every day, fuel must be pumped in, ammunition must be trucked in, spare parts must be shipped in, soldiers must be rotated in. And every resource directed at sustaining Crimea is a resource pulled from the southern front, from Donbass, from the units actually trying to advance. Ukrainian war analyst Otroshchenko writes that academic studies are now being conducted on what he calls Crimea's transport isolation. This is no longer analysis, it is documented operational reality. And Ukraine's objective was never to land troops on the peninsula. The objective was to make the peninsula unusable as a military base. Crimea functions as Russia's air defense node, naval headquarters, command center, fuel reserve, and forward strike platform against Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is systematically dismantling each of those functions through logistics attrition rather than territorial assault. Fleet retreated, Kerch restricted, refineries burning, corridor under fire, depots destroyed, streets dark. The trap is closing, not in days or weeks, but through a slow tightening that becomes irreversible long before anyone declares it complete. So we return to the bridge, the road deck riddled with holes, the convoys rerouted, the QR codes exhausted, the tourists stranded, the radars dimming, the depots burning. A bridge was struck, and a strategy revealed itself. Russia spent 12 years building Crimea into a fortress. Ukraine spent the last 3 years discovering that fortresses with single supply arteries are not fortresses at all. They are siege targets waiting to be sieged. The visible story is a damaged bridge. The real story is that the entire logic of military occupation in the drone age is being rewritten in real time, on a peninsula Russia called unsinkable. Which leaves the only question that actually matters. If a bridge worth millions can be neutralized by drones worth thousands, and if the peninsula it feeds now consumes more resources than it provides, how much longer can Russia afford to hold Crimea at all? And when the answer becomes obvious to Moscow, what happens to every other distant outpost, in every other contested geography, defended by the same outdated assumptions? The bridges were the invisible front line of this war. Russia is losing that front, and the implications are only beginning to surface. Thank you for watching. If this analysis added something to how you see the conflict, subscribe to the Worldline Network. And if you prefer to follow these breakdowns while driving, you can also find us on Spotify. The next phase of this story is already unfolding, and we will be there when it does.